Greetings sailors and welcome back to World of Warships and another supporter spotlight. We've got a bit of a Soviet theme going on today and also a bit of a brain derp theme, although that's usual for most of my videos. I'm actually recording this at, well, it's 1:07 AM right now. This is the most awake I've felt all day. It's just been one of those days. I had to have a good long sleep during the day because I slept so badly last night. So, yeah, but I'm here now. I'm sat in front of the computer recording and my brain doesn't feel like a bag of squirrels with ADHD. So let's have a go at making a video. Oh, that was probably way too much information. Talking of information, this is a newcomer to this strand, although they're not a new patron. I think they've been a patron for a little while now, but this is Martin Ludens, which is their actual username. I'm not just willy-nilly giving out somebody's, you know, personal name, their meat space name. That's what the young hip kids call it nowadays, right? But this is the first time I've had a replay of theirs to show off, or rather I've had the replay for a while, but it went to the wrong bit of my inbox, my Gmail inbox. So I was kind of sorting through and thinking, who haven't I shown a replay from recently, and sifting through and looking at recent emails, and realised that this was actually one of my patrons that sent me this. So apologies, Martin Ludens. I think we'll just go with Martin. That's probably a little easier. It was entirely, again, my own derpitude, because, you know, I am me. Anyhow, this is a ship I'm sure most of you have seen around at some point. This is the Vladivostok. Soviet battleships are not a new sight at this stage. Although he is wearing one of the less common camos. Well, I don't see it very often, but maybe I just don't see the Vladivostok often enough to see if players are using this camo or not. But the glorious Soviet motherland camo with all its red flags and... what do you even call those? I wouldn't say bunting, but it's not bunting. The big swags of cloth, and I don't know, there's probably a name for it. The curtains, it's got fancy curtains on. Yeah, let's just go with that. In common with all Soviet battleships, you've got the limited damage control party, and it's better the closer you go. And that's going to be a theme of both of these games. Both of these games are going to be Soviet battleships getting to be close up and personal. But there's still going to be some more decent longer ranged shots. I have to say, this is one of the reasons why I don't especially enjoy this line myself. And Martin in their email said that they weren't either especially enjoying this ship, although maybe they thought better of other ships of the line. I mean, the Sinop is considered to be a very strong tier 7. And of course there's the tier 10, the Moskva, which is so weak. It's such a weak ship. Nobody plays that ship, right? Not the Moskva. Wow. The Kremlin. The Moskva's actually, well, not that common a sight. You still see them, but yeah, it's not special anymore, really, is it? But I'm sort of getting aside from what I was trying to say, which is that they weren't enjoying this ship so much, and I don't enjoy it so much either, because of the nature of the dispersion, but also, in fact, probably more so because of the nature of the limited damage control party and the fact that you have one less heal. I just don't quite get on with that somehow. So Martin taking a bit of a defensive turn here. They could nose into the cap, but there's no real urgent need to yet. He's taking the more cautious course of action, because we know there is a Fubuki around somewhere. Caution is, however, the last thing apparently on this Fiji's mind. They were safely ensconced and firing behind that island, which you can do with the British cruiser 6-inch arcs quite easily, but then they decided to charge out into the open, And in a Fiji, that's not going to go very well for them. It's not exactly known for its armour. In fact, the next replay will also feature a Tier 7 cruiser doing something particularly questionable as well. So the Fiji's desperately trying to get away, but surprise, surprise, they didn't. This Graf Spee also now turning tail. The Bismarck has been not the most aggressive. They've taken a fair bit of damage, but I think they've by now realised that they are not in a good spot. They really aren't, so he's just kind of delaying the inevitable. And while this is going on, the Chapayev, nearly over on the other side, well, over at the ACAP anyway, it's within the Chapayev's range, obviously, has decided to take opportunity of the distraction over here and basically get in some cheeky shots onto Martin Ludens' ship. I did say I was going to say Martin, didn't I? And then I just made it awkward and clunky again. Did I mention it's like 1 AM? So there goes that Fubuki. Not entirely sure what the Fubuki was trying to do there. I mean, obviously drop torps, but in terms of doing it stealthily, that was a fairly significant failure that entirely cost them their ship. And there wasn't any real sign of them before that point. All of Martin's kind of cautious manoeuvres really didn't need to be done at all, because apparently the Fubuki was more or less just behind the island and not doing much, which is slightly odd. They could have been putting torpedoes across the cap. But, you know, that's our team's gain, or Martin's team's gain, and that just now leaves this Bismarck to deal with. Now, we're temporarily blinded by the inconvenient smoke that the Fubuki put down, but that's not going to be a factor for very long. Meanwhile, that Chapayev's still taking pot shots all the while. And with the nature of the damage control party and the one less heal, fire damage is a bit more of a vulnerability for these ships. You do have to think a lot more carefully about if you're going to use a damage control party to extinguish fires, just because you don't have the healing capacity that other ships have available with either extra heals, and generally speaking the other ships that don't have as many heals have stronger heals, and that's not the case with Soviet ships. More of an upper belt slash superstructure aimed shot here. He's not confident about it penetrating the belt at that angle, even though it was reasonably flat, but it was still enough of an angle that it might have bounced. So he took the safer course of action, and as they were pretty low health, that was enough damage done to finish them off. So the situation is, we've got 2 caps, we've pulled ahead on points. The enemy team only has 4 ships left, as opposed to about half of this team, but it's still going to get a bit closer than that. I mean, apart from anything else, we just lost a destroyer, which closes the gap a little bit. And the Furious is also very low health. Potentially they could be taken out by the Ark Royal in an airstrike. It's not... You don't see carriers striking each other as much these days, but it's not exactly an impossible position or proposition, even if they are not, you know, they don't have a particularly hard strike. Or having said that, Ark Royal's triple torp bombers is it's quite a nice feature to have, especially compared to even the tier 8. The Implacable only has, I think, double drops rather than the triple drops. So yeah, I don't discount the Ark Royal, but I don't think the enemy Ark Royal has been particularly a threat in this game. And we won't see them from Martin's perspective until the very end. So with the carrier going after, there we go, taking out that enemy destroyer. I can't even quite see what that was. We have now just the Massachusetts and that cheeky Chapayev left. And the Chapayev really does know what they're doing. They've been taking all of the opportunistic shots that they can, and they've lost a fair chunk of health in the process, but it says something that they're one of the last alive. You really do have to learn to keep your head on a swivel in the, particularly the Soviet destroyers there, the Soviet cruisers, just because they have the relatively wide turning radii. And so you can't necessarily dodge on a dime. You have to take your chances to get in 3 damage against people whose turrets are pointed, for example, away from you where you can. Now, Massachusetts has taken a pretty big chunk. They're angling a little better now, but are they straightening out again? Because it kind of looks like they might do, and that's not a wise thing to do in front of a Soviet battleship. Yep, no, it looks like they're attempting to make a turn. Well, this is absolutely just fine and dandy as far as he's concerned. Although, as it turns out, yeah, those hits not quite so good. The reload on Soviet battleships is, generally speaking, a bit longer than their counterparts, so sometimes you will struggle to get those shots where just, you know, a second or 2 less would have helped you greatly. So that should have been really punishing for the Massachusetts, but ended up not being. And meanwhile, the Zara that pressed ahead with him has been taken out by, appropriately, the secondaries, but not before managing to get some torpedoes. I think that was their torpedoes in there. Or was that airdrop torpedoes? I didn't actually catch who caused that flooding. But as it is, it's Martin that gets that kill for his 4th kill. And if he can get 1 more, it'll be a Kraken. The Chapayev is, however, nearly behind the cover of the island. And of course, they've had free reign to ping away at Ludens and just keep setting fires, just keep sapping his health while he was dealing with the Massachusetts. So it's going to be a little bit of a struggle to get this guy in time. I mean, if he just comes round the edge of the island at close range, he puts himself at risk of the short range but very high speed Chapayev torps. Or else, maybe he might catch sight of the carrier. It depends. The carrier was less seen going in this direction. But who knows? They could be behind the island. Although the direction of the plane seems to indicate they have continued to the northwest corner. Anyway, the Chapayev tries a very cheeky thing there and actually gets away with it. Just comes out long enough to fire the rear turrets. And luckily for them, getting another fire, but 1 single fire isn't enough to threaten him, although he has actually burned all of his heals by this point. He's only got damage control parties left, and he's hanging on to those just because he knows he can survive this single fire. It does, however, look like, though, he's not really going to get a chance to get this 5th kill. I mean, the Chapayev's coming out, so if he's lucky, yes, but he'd have to basically nail the Ark Royal with citadels in order to secure that kill. And of course, he's not the only person left alive. There is still this Edinburgh, which caused him a little bit of a scare earlier on with the torpedoes, and with their much faster rate of fire, well, we'll see who gets there. He's getting some overpens, which is taking the health of the Chapayev down, but unfortunately all it does is set up the kill for the Edinburgh. If he'd been really mercenary about it, he could have waited until the Edinburgh had done a bit more damage and then fired, but it's tricky getting the timing with something like that, just because of the much faster rate of fire of something like the Edinburgh. That just about nails the hope that he had of getting a Kraken out of this, because we have run out of points. But nonetheless, it was still a very impressive game with Confederate Dev Strike, Fireproof Dreadnought and High Caliber, and 160,000 damage done. All the while being able to more or less get fairly up close and personal with members of the enemy team. And actually there, despite it being a bottom tier game, it was the Furious that managed to get 2nd place, as well as the Edinburgh surviving, or the surviving Edinburgh rather, being in 3rd. On to the damage breakdown, and as you can see, quite a lot of damage received, but most of it was from the Chapayev just burning him constantly. So that Chapayev did all right out of that game, but just wasn't able to kill him. But still, walking away with over 2 million potential is not half bad. On to the second replay, and it is up a tier with the Sovetsky Soyuz, which I'm possibly not pronouncing quite correctly, but I looked it up on Google Translate and everything, so, you know, that's probably about as close as correct as you're going to get from me. This time it is Andy CX, who is a very long-standing patron at this point, so we've gone with a very, well, a new to the series and then a very familiar name to this series. And he likes his battleships, or at least the good games he tends to send in are more often battleships than anything else. It's not like he only plays battleships, but I think it's safe to say he reasonably likes his battleships. There is one thing about this replay, by the way, you've already possibly noticed it. The last one was an 8.10 replay. This is an 8.9 replay, and there's a bit of a weird bug that's more just slightly irritating than anything else. When he's in artillery view, you'll notice it gets kind of jerky. That's the replay itself. That's nothing to do with the rendering or the video editing or the recording or anything like that. That's just a pure replay bug that I can't do anything about, unfortunately. So apologies if you find that somewhat annoying. Anyhow, what is there to say? Well, it is good matchmaking. He's top tier. There is a carrier in play, which is not necessarily ideal. The Soviet battleships are not exactly monster AA powerhouses, although they're all right. It's not like it's a specific deficit of these ships, like with, say, the secondary batteries. If you're doing secondary build Soviet battleships, then oh boy, you are doing it ever so slightly wrong. Although I suppose you could as a kind of meme build, but it would not exactly be an efficient use of captain points or modules. But in all other regards, you know, they're not bad ships. It's the same 16-inch guns. Well, possibly not the exact same type of 16-inch guns, but they're still 16-inch guns in line with the Vladivostok's armament. And the armour as well, just like the Vladivostok, is pretty good for these close-range engagements, which is useful because that's a Georgia that's just steamed round the corner. That thing, of course, has 18-inch guns, but they're not the Lolpen 18.1-inch guns of the Yamato and the Musashi, so he doesn't have to worry that much. Because he's only got the 4 barrels that he can point forwards, he's less threatening overall as well than the 6 barrels that Musashi and Yamato can muster. Now again, this is going to be one of those occasions when the reload just feels that tiny bit too long. You can see he's trying to go into forward gear again to get that rear turret around for this lovely broadside, and isn't able to do it, but he does get the reload on his front turrets just in time to, well, aim it just that little bit high so it can go over the limb of that island and result in a bunch of overpens. If he'd had just the second or two quicker reloads of one of the other tier 9 battleships, then that would not have been an issue, and he'd have had a lovely Georgia broadside to smack. By the way, as promised, here is that second tier 7 cruiser doing a very silly thing, all for the sake of making a torpedo drop. The Miyoko's torpedo angles, if you don't know, are fairly restricted in the rear quarter, so yeah, you really do have to show lots of broadside in order to make the drop. And they've already lost most of their health, and now in their panic trying to angle a little bit to avoid return fire, they've just given Andy a nice kill. They did land some torpedoes into that Nelson, and that's going to cost the Nelson later on in terms of survivability, because it's heavy hits, it's heavy damage that's been done, which cannot be as readily healed. But was that worth sacrificing your ship for? I mean, it's a pretty good ship, the Miyoko, so I personally would say no. Anyway, the next threat to immediately be a problem is this mast, and Andy actually makes a bit of a mistake here, in my opinion. He starts turning away. My instinct would absolutely to have been to nose in. Now that obviously decreases the amount of reaction time you have to dodging torpedoes, but if you're turning away like this and someone has their torpedoes out, they are much more likely to land a lot more of them. Fortunately for Andy though, he's going to get away with it, because although the mast has put out torpedoes, apparently they didn't quite have them reloaded in time for when Andy was at his most vulnerable, and so although this was a very suboptimal torpedo dodging turn, it's going to turn out to have been a completely successful one. So there go the torpedoes, quite harmlessly sailing by. And if they can just press forward, and hopefully this York has a Hydra, although if they do, they're showing no signs of using it just yet, that would be even better. But even if they don't, the mast is not a stealthy destroyer. And if they're sensible, they will be breaking out of the smoke on the far side. But they aren't sensible. Instead, they do this for reasons I'm not sure I can really understand. They had ample opportunity to get out of the rather short duration of German smoke and get back into the relative safety of that cap, but instead they did the opposite. Clearly they were going for some reverse psychology, because it was the last thing you'd expect them to do, right? Anyhow, that's that torpedo threat dealt with. I mean, the individual German torps don't do that much damage, but again, it's heavy damage. Restricts how much you can heal. And that just leaves the Georgia, who really did get a potentially nice, from their perspective, shot on Andy's broadside as he was coming around again. And possibly this was, again, not the best positioning from Andy. I mean, if he had been nose in to begin with, that really wouldn't have been an issue, coming round that corner to try and take out the Georgia. But as it was, he got quite lucky there. Doubly so when you count in what happened with the destroyer as well, and trebly so when you factor in the amount of damage he was just able to take off that Georgia. The Georgia's not dead yet though, and when I was actually first viewing this, I thought for sure the Georgia and the North Carolina were going to boop each other, because the Georgia has not that much health. They are taking torpedoes from, I think, the Benson that tried to cap B. But I don't think any of those actually hit. So it would be the better trade for the Georgia to kill the North Carolina in a ram, just in terms of trading a healthy ship for an unhealthy one, and the fact that they're both battleships, and they are ahead on points. But as it happens, we don't get this kind of cancellation, this neutralization of two battleships happening. They actually kind of drive past, and I think the North Carolina takes a fair bit of damage in the process, or is going to take a fair bit of damage, and the Georgia isn't going to survive, but they have significantly weakened that North Carolina. But crucially, it's going to be a living North Carolina. They're not going to equally trade one battleship for another. So in retrospect, yeah, the ram would have been the correct thing to do from the Georgia's point of view, but even better would have been not getting themselves into that position to begin with, because again, they seem to have some opportunity to pull back into the cap and maybe try and make some kind of getaway, but instead they left it for far too long and got very badly out of position. You'll see Andy getting a little annoyed with the North Carolina in the chat, by the way. He's keenly aware of the North Carolina's position, and yes, they are playing very cautiously, but we will give it to them. Based on how this is going to work out, the North Carolina doesn't turn out to be all that useless. It turns out they were in fact doing useful and important things for the team, but if you watch them over the next couple of minutes, you will see them taking a rather circuitous course that isn't going particularly anywhere near any enemy ships, and in fact involves sailing south around that island on the eye line for some reason. But that still puts them within range of the Rune and presumably these two battleships here that Andy is engaging, the Ashitaka, which is a fairly nice target for these guns. You can comfortably overmatch the bow plating with these 16-inch guns. And also a Roma, who has got plenty of penetration with their shells, but not exactly the best accuracy of any battleship ever. He's also next to this Nelson, who is absorbing quite a lot of attention right now, at least from the Roma. The Nelson, of course, has the exact same problem as the Ashitaka, only even more so. They have a far more all-round exposed citadel to anything with 15-inch and above guns. So that is, presumably from the Roma's point of view, going to seem to them to be the much easier kill, and to be fair, would be the much easier kill. And if the Ashitaka had been firing at them with their 16-inch guns as well, the Nelson might be dead by now. But as it is, because those two battleships were splitting their fire, they are both still alive. Meanwhile, the Gneisenau that was trying to defend the... was it the B cap? Or the C cap? I can't... the mini-map is just slightly too fuzzy. I think it's the C cap, yeah. And they got taken out, unfortunately, so the battleship down there, but they have defended the cap, so they're still getting the points. It's just that that Rune Helm? What was I even trying to say there? That's not a word. That's not a word at all. The Rune is rather healthy, and is going to take a speculative pot shot, but at this range he doesn't have that much hope of doing any significant damage. There is still the York and the North Carolina, though. They're slowly making their way over there. Talking of people slowly making their way to places, well, the Roma hasn't gone anywhere, and in fact is going to do a rather curious thing, at least as far as I'm concerned. I think they were just that keen to try and kill this Nelson that they decided to... well, they've come round the north. It's sort of technically a flanking manoeuvre. But Andy's been able to react soon enough that although he's not going to be able to save the Nelson from these shots... yeah! That hurt. That really hurt. And the Roma isn't even trying to turn in. It's not like they've come round this corner with the intention of angling in bow on towards Andy. No, they're just sailing on past. And I don't fancy their chances of surviving much longer. I mean, yes, they killed the Nelson, but in terms of tier 7 for a tier 8, and in terms of the hit points trade, as it were, between the Nelson and what the Roma had coming into that, that was a pretty bad idea. That was, yeah, that was not in the enemy team's favour at all. So now it's just the Rune and the carrier. And the carrier hasn't troubled Andy at all up until now, but you'd better believe that as the closest target, and one at half health, that he is going to suddenly be of interest. And although he hasn't taken all of the HE spam that Martin had to endure in the previous game, well, instead of it being a carrier 2 tiers lower, this time it is a carrier that's only 1 tier lower. I guess thank goodness it wasn't a tier 10 carrier in this game, although that would have been a tier 10 game overall, so I don't know why I voiced that thought. It doesn't really have any relevance. Did I mention it's 1 AM? So the Shikaku has sufficient attack planes clearly to go for full squads, which is definitely not what you want to see in a big, fat, slow battleship at this stage of the game. especially one with a more limited number of heals than normal. And it hurts. Even just that one drop hurts, and they're not done yet. And there's not really that much he can do to dodge this. I mean, yes, he's shooting down some of these planes, and yes, actual damage done isn't that great, but it's forced him to use a damage control, it's forced him to use a heal, and because it's heavy damage, he cannot, of course, heal that much back. I keep banging on about that, but you know, it's one of those things I'm not sure people always quite understand, is the difference between the types of damage and mechanically what it means. Anyway, so rocket planes now to come and set a fire, but here's where being in a Soviet battleship is actually proving beneficial, because you have a much slower I almost said refractory period then. Slow is not even the right word. The much quicker refractory period between using your damage control party. That's exactly the right word to use, right? Yeah. A much quicker cooldown is what I should have said, and instead my 1 AM in the morning brain decided to intervene. Okay, anyway, let's just keep smoothly gliding past that. We have the torp bombers returning, and this is pretty bad. This might be the end of Andy. He's blown his last heal. He does have a bunch of damage control parties left, but you know, if he gets a flooding he can instantly nix it, but that's about all he can do. And because he's taken a relatively high amount of heavy damage, yeah, he could maybe be doing a bit better now in terms of what he could get back. You can see there, by the way, that North Carolina are down to not a lot of hit points, but they have taken out the runes. So, like I said, it's not like they weren't doing anything, but I can sort of understand Andy's frustration, given their positioning and apparent lack of will to go and fight. But they have secured an important kill, and well, now that we know exactly where the carrier is, because they had to be close, and for some reason they have made their position a bit too well known. I'm not entirely sure why they're there and not tucked further around behind one of the islands on the 2-3 line, or even up in the corner. You know, sometimes being closer to the ships that you want to hit is a great boon, and in Andy's case especially, you know, he's really very close. This Shikaku's made him a priority and managed to get him down from half health to this, like 10,000 hit points, or no, it's about 15k. But I mean, arguably they could be going for the North Carolina, who's much more vulnerable. So again, a bit of a tactical error from this Shikaku. They seem to have fixated on trying to kill Andy in particular. I mean, while it was capping, okay, that certainly made sense, but we're now at the stage where, well, he's got the cap anyway, and if you can kill a battleship, if you could kill the North Carolina or Andy, that's it. And it almost looks like he's going to get to kill Andy, and then suddenly the game ends. And the very first time I saw this replay, I was like, wait, what? What happened? I thought this was going to be a defeat, but I'm sure I remember the score screen saying it was a victory. Well, just in case you missed that very final message that popped up briefly before the end, we're going to see it as it happened, the moment of victory. Well, we've already seen there the North Carolina putting in a shot, which is really important because that then sets up the friendly Shikaku to get the kill. And that was just in the second or two before that Shikaku's torps would have killed Andy and made it a victory for the other side. This really did come down to the last couple of seconds. It could have gone either way. And so, kudos to the Shikaku and the North Carolina, but definitely kudos to Andy as well, with his nearly 200,000 damage, 2.5k base XP, and a heck of a lot of damage weathered. Although not as much as the previous game, not as much as the Vladivostok. I think because he took much more heavy damage. There we go, 50,000 torpedo damage. And a lot of that will have been from the carrier. Did he take any other torpedoes? I don't think he did. I think that was all from the carrier. So that was a bit of a squeaker, really. They just got victory, and if the Shikaku had gone for the North Carolina instead, they could have won it for the other side. But there were some questionable decisions from other teammates as well. I don't want to lump it all on that one player. Some of Andy's team probably did silly things, and we certainly saw some of the enemy team getting themselves into not particularly good positions as well. So yeah, it was still a nail-biter though. I mean, that really was about as close a game as I've ever featured on this channel. I'm sure I've had others that are just about as close, but maybe not any that came down to quite that much of a knife edge, where it was just like, you know, 2 seconds in it either way. Maybe I've done one in the past where it came down to victory points ticking down, but in terms of, you know, one side getting a kill or the other just being that final decisive factor, yeah, that was, as I say, a bit nail-biting. So that's it for this video. Hopefully you have enjoyed it, and if you have, you can do all the usual things down underneath it. And of course, as always, stay tuned for more.